Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs. My co-host is Chuck Mason. And today we're going to welcome Pat Stamm. Welcome. Pat is the educational manager of the National Genealogical Society, or also known as NGS. Welcome.
Thank you.
And you're going to educate us today on newspapers, what we can find from newspapers. So,
newspapers are a love of my life. So many people just look at just for obituaries, but there is so much more in newspapers.
what you want to start with the metropolitan newspapers, the big newspapers?
Yeah, the newspapers can be classified in metropolitan newspapers, and they're the ones that talk about everything. They may be out of New York or even here, Washington, D.C., and they have a little bit of information about world news and the United States news, and they spend less time working about the local news. So those are the big regional newspapers.
So what are you thinking of, like a New York Times or what?
Washington Post, LA Times, the big ones that we see over and over and over again.
Okay, so if we're interested in something personal, how does something like that help us?
Well, then you go into the more local ones, and these are the ones that have the news of the day in their particular area. A regional newspaper may be, for us in St. Louis, it's the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, the Missouri Republican, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. These handle stories from around the area. Which ones do you have around here?
Well, we have mainly the Washington Post and the Times, and the Washington Post does, I believe it's still Thursday, does a local, and so depending on where you're living, there's a section on Northern Virginia or Fairfax County, Prince William County, Prince George's County over in Maryland.
But every day there's a metro section.
There's a metro section that does.
And the style section deals more or less with, the style has movie stars and stuff too. But the metro section deals with more of the local things.
But it's all over kind of the local stuff where specifically that one that they do, as I say, I think is still on Thursdays, is specific to the county that you're living in.
And see, I'm thinking of the local, more newspapers like in Delaware, the Evening Journal, okay, because it focused more on Delaware, even though they would have the articles from across the United States. It would focus more on Delaware news than anything else.
Well, then there's also things like the Springfield Independent. Or
that one.
I mean, the communities around the area, often they're just almost free or very, very inexpensive because the advertising pays for it.
And that's one of the newspapers, or those are the two types of newspapers that many people start with. But there is so much more. We were talking earlier about the ethnic newspapers. People, as they came into the United States, would publish their own newspapers. There were papers for the Danes, the Germans, the Hungarians, the Italians.
You had one up there, Irish Searching for Friends, I think, or Searching for Family.
Yeah, that was in the Boston newspaper, and it's called Finding Friends, and it was published by the Boston Pilot. Initially, it was in the newspaper, but then Boston University has now put it onto their website, and it's called, now that I'm trying to thinking of it, Finding Friends, if I'm not mistaken, by Boston University, and you can put in an entry and find information where people put little notices, and this would be in case somebody died, in case I'm looking for somebody. It didn't necessarily have to be from Ireland coming in here. It could be anywhere in the United States that they would put these little articles in there.
Well, there's a couple of others that I can give an example of. I think you had an example of a German one, or I can't remember the name of it, but the Aufbau is one that I know, I'm familiar with. I'm not sure exactly when it started, late 30s, early 40s, and it was German Jewish immigrants. And I know there were notices in there of searching for family, hoping that they were alive, assuming that wherever they were in the world, they were going to see this, and obituaries too. And I know that the newspaper went to South Africa, where there were a lot of people, a lot of German Jews ended up there, at least some. And I mean, that's just another example of that type of thing. That's and some of that is indexed. I don't know exactly what years they have indexed now, but I know they're working on indexing it and putting the whole, you find the name and then you click and you can see the article.
And of course, local newspapers, where I grew up in New Jersey, you kind of had the newspapers in the larger cities, but the counties that really didn't necessarily have a large city, you had a county-wide newspaper that kind of covers, and still in both Camden County and Gloucester County, still exists today. The Gloucester County paper goes back to the 1830s or 40s, and it's gone through probably 8 or 10 name changes, but it's still being published. And the great part about some of these newspapers are they're online. So even if you don't live in the area, you can go online and read them.
Are there new editions online?
The new editions, yes.
So
yes.
who pays for it then? I'm just curious.
I guess, well, I know the two that I read, the Gloucester County and the Camden County papers, there's a lot of paid advertisement. Over on the right-hand side, there's the running advertisements of things, and sometimes I'm now starting to see where they'll, in between, like the obituaries, when you pull them up, there'll be advertisements about every 3 or 4 obituaries. There's another advertisement, so they're hitting you with that, and you have to continue scrolling down.
Well, they have to have some way of paying
and some of them do also do subscriptions. The Camden County one, part of it is free, but if you want all the news stories, then you pay a subscription fee and you can read the whole paper online. I know the Washington Post here in the DC area does that same thing.
And they've been doing that. You know, the great thing about those county newspapers, though, one of the things that they have in them are these, and please understand, they're local area columns.
Yes.
And in those local area columns, you would have people visiting and relatives doing whatever activity that they were doing.
They have had that in the Gloucester County one when I was growing up as a kid. So, when my sister got hit on the playground at school and got stitches, the next door neighbor or the neighbor down the street, both were reporters. One or the other had that in. And my mother had a sister that died in 1936, and I looked for a death notice or an obituary. This was when I was just beginning genealogy, and I found nothing, and I didn't understand why, but I thought, well, I know my grandparents didn't have a whole lot of money. But later I went back and looked again, and it still didn't appear. But then as I was scrolling the microfilm back, I thought, oh, I wonder if they still had, or if they had the local community sections. And so that was where the notice was. The reporter that did the little town they lived in the county put in extending the community sympathy, and it included when the viewing and the funeral home all in the end of the little article there. So that was the obituary that I found for her.
And I ended up finding a similar situation, except in my newspaper it had the obituary for the relative there, and it mentioned that she had 27 great-great-grandchildren.
Sure. Wow.
And in the local, I'll use the word gossip column, there it showed a listing of the great-grandchildren and where they were from, that they were in town visiting because of their great-grandmother's funeral. So you may get a little bit of information that you weren't expecting, so don't overlook those columns.
Yeah, they're great, just the little, like you say, the newsy news types of things that add interest.
What about the other special interest ones?
Occupations. If you have a farmer or a riverboat person or a number of professions, they have local newspapers that go just for that particular area. And they have all sorts of details about changing laws, which we would assume, but then they have activities from various areas. I'm thinking of the Riverboat newspaper. and they document activities in each one of the ports along. So if you're talking about the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, you would have Cincinnati putting in information, as well as St. Louis, as well as all the cities along the rivers.
Well,
That's interesting. I never heard of something like that.
along occupational things too, I just happened to think the dairy farm that my father's father worked on was owned by a rather large company that had farms all over southern New Jersey. And I know my grandfather used to take milk up to New York City to hotels up there. And they had not really a newspaper, but they had a magazine that was put out, I think it was every other month. And that kind of had news items in it too, in addition to pictures. I have a couple of editions where there's pictures of my grandfather and a couple of my father's brothers in some of the editions because it was taken at the farm that they specifically were at.
Well, and a lot of the companies would have their own newspapers as such. Railroad lines, the Union Pacific or any number of railroad lines, Southern Pacific, had a newspaper there. And you would have, again, retirements, births, marriages, deaths, baseball activity, just a whole number of things
What
in
about
there.
something like military?
Oh, those are what I consider specialty newspapers. Specialty newspapers don't really fall into an occupation category, but they have information about an activity. If anybody has ever been stationed overseas, we all had the Stars and Stripes newspaper. And it's still being published. It started right before World War I, or World War II, if I'm not mistaken. And they would have activities from home, but they would have activities across Europe or whatever their theater was. There's another one that you and I were talking about earlier, and that's the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. And they have a newspaper called
Happy Days, and it was put out by the individual camps. And there's a large collection in Chicago, and I forget exactly the place in Chicago. But if you look up on the internet, do a search for Happy Days, I'm sure it'll come up. But that's how I found it. And these were put out by the camps, and it included lots of information on the activities and the men that were in the various CCC camps and
pictures.
What they were doing, pictures in some cases. Some of them were more of a printed newspaper. Others looked like they went off the old ditto machines that we had when we were in school. And but that's the largest collection. But where I first found them was at the National Archives College Park campus out in Maryland, and they had them there in the files for the various camps. So if you knew an ancestor was working in a particular camp, you can go out, get the file, get lots of information, and there may be some copies of the newsletter in there.
You dealt with file folders. I dealt with the microfilm.
Okay.
And College Park also has microfilm for some of these Happy Days.
Well, I was concentrating more on the camp itself, so I didn't get into so much. I did a little bit on the Happy Days, but I didn't get into
both
it.
of you have been talking mainly about the United States. I want to say something about some of the foreign newspapers, which
please.
the Library of Congress does have. There's one that I've used. It started around 1860. And I was looking specifically for an article in 1867, and they had most of it. And then I found some of it up in Baltimore. It's now pretty much online. It's called Dear Israel. It had a huge obituary, three column obituary of my grandfather. And lots of, if you read something like that, of course you have to read German. That was in German. And it was aimed at German Jews in the Mainz area, and different towns had something like that too. So that if you know the foreign language that you're dealing with, that's another source. Those were public newspapers, but focused on a particular population. And of course you had your private newspapers too, private things like your church or we can.
Right. There's a lot of Christian, no, I shouldn't say Christian, religious newspapers. Let me adjust that, because they've been published, and we have a copy, I think, of the Christian Advocate. And it was published in regional areas as well as nationally, so you could come up with all sorts of details. They're interesting because in the ones that I have dealt with, in some of them, they would have the church sermon from that previous Sunday embedded in the newspaper, so you could see what was going on.
Well, our synagogue has this. I don't know if churches have it. We have what they call a monthly bulletin, and it certainly lists the death of anybody. It lists special occasions, marriages, bar mitzvahs, whatever, births. So if you happen to know where somebody, what congregation they belong to, whatever religion, you can check and see if they have it. And then if that institution no longer exists, then you can check at the next higher level of them. I know for many Jewish things, they're in Cincinnati, in the library there, in the
kind of depends
Hebrew
on
Union College.
the church. Some churches have just their Sunday bulletin. Some have newsletters, and I know with the Methodist Church, Drew University in New Jersey has a large collection of records, and I know they have some church newsletters and all. The Catholic Church has the Catholic Herald, and I don't know specifically where, but I know that they are archived somewhere at some facility. And that's, Arlene kind of brought up a point here talking about the Library of Congress, and that is, where do you find newspapers? The Library of Congress, for those of us who live here, is a real great source, and they do have some things online. They certainly don't have as much online as I'd like to see, and particularly for areas I'd like to see, but that's the one place that I usually go to. And then I have found, depending on the area, historical, genealogical societies, state archives, state libraries, and don't forget to cross the border on a state, because New Jersey, the Camden County paper is in about 6 different facilities, depending on the time period. There's no one facility that has the entire run of the paper. And lo and behold, I had heard that the Free Library in Philadelphia did have, and I checked into that, and lo and behold, they did. So I don't have to go to Trenton and Camden and Cherry Hill and all these facilities. I can go over to Philadelphia and get the newspapers.
I'm surprised,
there.
As they microfilm, they don't exchange them so that each one has the complete.
It just depends. I mean, the state archives has a large collection, but it's kind of funny the way what they have and what they don't have, and they'll have a period of time, and then they'll have nothing, and then they'll have later another collection, and yet I found what's missing in another location. So I guess it just depends on what they can collect.
And what's ending up happening, and I've seen it in my area, some of the universities are starting to digitize newspapers. So if you go on to your particular area, such as Illinois, and just put in Illinois digital newspapers into a web search, one of the universities there are taking and collecting newspapers and digitizing them. And that is separate from the newspapers that the state holds at the Abraham Lincoln Library. So you have 2 resources available to you there. Same way with Missouri. California has a lot of those type of things. And again, we've said this before, we can start with the web, but sometimes it's not all there. But at least we have all sorts of references. So, good stuff. One thing, let me go back to some of the articles though, because when you track a newspaper, you may see an article that pertains to you, especially if it's an accident. If it is like a riverboat accident or a railroad accident or whatever, you want to track the other newspapers along that particular line, because they may have different details. Your newspaper may only have a short few sentences that they can fit in that particular day. The next newspaper may have a column and a half that they have to fill out. So they may have more details and more information and more names.
It can also be political, too.
Yes.
I was in Germany a few years ago in a local town, and one newspaper had this much on the gathering of 50 people that were there for the first time using the Bad Arolsen records, which are the captured Nazi records in Bad Arolsen, Germany. And it's the first time that the archives had been open to the public or anything. Another newspaper had like 2 pages on us. Yeah. So you can see what the political views of the different groups are.
Sorry.
And this would certainly be true if there's more than one newspaper published in a certain area, too, that they're focusing on something or want to play down or play up something.
I had family members that were, in 1957, they were killed in an automobile accident in Gloucester County, but it was right where Cumberland, Atlantic, and Gloucester all met, their borders met, and all 3 county newspapers, plus the Salem County paper, had information. Not all of it was correct. Each paper had more information than some of the rest of them, but it was well worth checking those out. The other thing I have found was also check later. I had a case where a collateral family member had the habit of walking the railroad tracks between her 2 sons' houses, and she was deaf and got hit by a train one night. And mysteriously, the next night, that train had a derailment. And the one son was accused of doing the damage to cause this derailment. So later on, I looked through the paper, and there was the information on the court case, on the trial where he was brought to trial. And it ended up they couldn't prove that he had done it. They strongly suggest that he did, but they couldn't prove that he did. So it's well worth looking at the follow-up things that may be there for the papers.
No. Yeah, you've got to follow up on some of these. What about the National Endowment for Humanities, the Library of Congress and that?
The newspaper and periodical room, it's amazing. And what
They've been
have
digitizing newspapers from across the country. And you can go onto the Library of Congress website, and it is right there at the front page. Click on it, and then you can actually go in and see. Now, the newspapers are only going up to 1922 for right now, and basically that's because of copyright law. So they don't have to go in and look for individuals. One other key word when you're searching for newspapers is newspaper morgue, because in the newspaper industry, they all ended up having their own envelopes where they would keep information on people that were constantly showing up in the newspaper. It may be just a little clipping. It may be handwritten notes. It may be references to other newspaper articles. So always look for newspaper morgues.
And that's where they kept their own notes so they could write the article later on.
Later, and oftentimes too, the obituary, when somebody famous they would pull the morgue file out and get all the information about a person's career.
Now, we're leaving the newspapers just a little tiny bit, but still that kind of published materials are things like the Genealogical Society newsletters, or sometimes they're more like almost like magazines. We've got a lot of stuff, and I think probably most genealogical societies have something like that. I don't know whether any of them are online, but it's the kind of thing that you want to pursue because they tell you where to look for local things.
Some of the national organizations have things that are on their websites, although in some cases it's in a member-only section. The local Fairfax County Society here has all their newsletters, and they have talked, and I'm not on the board anymore, so I don't know whether they've finally moved forward with it, but they have talked about scanning all of their newsletters and making them available.
The National Genealogical Society has all of our quarterlies
Yes.
on our website. And again, it's members only section, but you have all of the old editions, and they also have their news magazine, which comes out. Now, I don't believe the news magazine goes all the way back, but the
No, I
more
don't
current
think.
ones.
I think it's the more current issues
Now,
of it.
You have a whole list here of newspaper.
Oh, isn't that great?
Can you get those at one location, or did you find these by?
No, it's just kind of a little bit of a toss-up. There's a bunch of various web pages, commercial organizations that are digitizing newspapers. Genealogy Bank, Roots Fold 3 also has some newspapers on it. So you can find them all the way across the board. You've got to remember it's free or fee-based websites, and when you're looking for them, you may come up against a individual newspaper that is shown the index on for free, but you would have to pay a fee to get to the paper. So it's up to you. Do some searches on Google Books or Internet Archives. Those are two prominent websites that are out there, and you can just put Internet Archives in a search engine, and it will take you right to the individual page.
So then you can put a name in, and it'll tell you whether that newspaper has an
Yes.
article on that person. So you're not paying the fee.
And getting
it's-
nothing.
And getting nothing. It's, a fee to get, I don't know, some local newspaper when that's really not where they might be mentioned. So.